How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Sector 6, and today we're going to be taking a look at a recent event that happened. I'm sure a lot of you will have heard about it, and it was the Summoning a Masterpiece panel Q&A presentation that was given by Naoki Hamaguchi and Yoshinori Kitase, and that was held at the Esports World Cup hosted in Riyadh by Qiddiya Gaming. And there was a few interesting bits and pieces that came out of this. Not a massive amount, a lot of it is kind of things that we'll already know. But I figured it would be worth looking into. I had a couple of comments asking me if I was going to take a look at it, so why not? Keep an eye out as well in the next couple of days for the breakdown of Chapter 12 of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We'll be jumping into that. But for now, let's jump into this and just have a little chat about what went down. So Kitase and Hamaguchi appeared on stage and they were talking about the past, the present and the future of Final Fantasy VII. So talking about the OG and the compilation, talking about Rebirth and Remake, and then also talking about Part 3. And one of the things that they keep on bringing up throughout this presentation is the synergy across the franchise and how the past of the franchise connects to the future of the franchise and everything like that, and how they've got to try and keep everything together and coherent, basically. And like I say, there's a lot of talk about that going throughout this presentation. Now, Kitase talks about how much looser and free-form development was back in the 90s, and how if they had an idea that they wanted to implement into the game, if they worked hard, they could get it done within a few days. He also talks about the limitations of the OG due to 3D tech being very new at the time, and he goes on then to talk about wanting to stay true to the essence of Final Fantasy VII, while also wanting to drive it forwards and evolve it. But Hamaguchi's experience with the OG is a little bit different to Kitase's, because for Hamaguchi, he talks about how he was rushing home after his final exams to play Final Fantasy VII, and it shows how long he's been invested in the franchise, and he's literally one of us. So that's pretty cool. That must be insane, like being a kid growing up playing FF7 like all of us did, but then at this point now working on FF7, like that must be crazy. He talks about his big moments and memories in Final Fantasy VII for him from his first playthrough, and he talks about it being the end of Disc 1 and Aerith's death, and how he and his friends got caught up in the whole bring Aerith back vibe. And I've seen a few people suggesting maybe he's hinting at something. I don't think so. I think everyone got caught up in the bring Aerith back vibe. Can we revive Aerith? Is there a way to get her back? Everyone bought into that, so I don't think he's necessarily hinting at something here. But you never know. You never know. He then goes on to talk about the world of Final Fantasy VII and how all of the different components of Final Fantasy VII are so skillfully woven together. So you have different areas like the Gold Saucer and Costa del Sol, which are resorts, basically. You have places like Icicle Inn and Bone Village, which are at the remote distances, and Medial as well, kind of remote locations that are out of the way. You've got Cosmo Canyon, which is this big planetology spot where all of the minds of planetology kind of come together and talk about things. He makes a good point how you've got all these different types of locations in Final Fantasy VII, Midgar being one of the craziest of them, and they all feel together. They all feel like they work together, and that's down to how expertly the world was crafted in Final Fantasy VII. And again, they bring up the synergy aspect of things and how they want to weave the two together. And they also talk about how the reception and the love from the fans has encouraged them to push on into Part 3 and make a game unlike anything people have seen before. And this is something that they keep bringing up. They are pushing the narrative that Final Fantasy VII Part 3, Remake Part 3, is going to be one of the most insane experiences that any of us have ever had in gaming. And this kind of talk makes me confident. It does. This kind of talk definitely makes me confident, and you'll see what I mean as we get a bit further on. They then go on to talk about how Remake is unique, as it's got older devs who worked on the OG, on older technology, with older ideals about developing games and making games, and gaming in general. But then you've also got younger devs who are pushing the boundaries currently and have got maybe slightly different ideas about gaming and how to put a game together and how to produce things. So it's creating an interesting mesh of the two styles, and that will work very well for Final Fantasy VII because we need both, realistically. You know, we need the people that know about what went down back in the 90s and what the thinking was and what the mindset was and everything like that in order to fully understand it, so that we can then reproduce it in a more palatable format for a newer gamer, a younger gamer, someone who wasn't about in those kind of Wild West days of 3D development. Because back in the 90s, 3D, when FF7 came out, it was pretty much brand new as far as gaming goes. So everything was trying for the first time. People were trying things and trying to figure things out and try to work out ways around problems, which led to them having a completely different mindset to developers of today, where they've got a completely different set of problems that they need to figure out. It's an interesting dynamic, and I'm sure it must work given how amazing Rebirth was. Like, they're doing something good. They're cooking. So, good on them. They go on to talk about just development of the game in general for a little bit after this, and how they wanted to add in new, different elements to the project overall. And they talk about the difficulties of recreating scenes like Aerith's death in a new way to maintain the impact of the scene for people that know what's coming, but also while trying to maintain the essence of that scene as well. And the way that they've done this is they say that they switch things up to show how Cloud couldn't process and let his feelings go regarding love and loss, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of that going forwards in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. They also talk about how people will come away from the scene with different ideas on what went down and what the state of things are now, and they're not wrong on that front. And maybe this is them kind of manufacturing that negative space that Sakaguchi's talked about in the past, where in older games you could leave a lot of things up to the imagination and our brains filled in the gaps. And is this a way for them to manufacture that type of negative space by creating doubt over a scene? It's interesting. Anyway, at this point we step away from the story a little bit. They talk about the open world and how they went about doing that, and how he's amazed at the open world that was created by Hamaguchi and the team. And they talk about how abandoning world map traversal in FF10 was a big thing for them, and they're very happy that they've been able to bring it back in Rebirth. And I don't think it's the same, but it's very close. And given like how much more detail there is, I don't think we could expect much more out of Rebirth's open world. It is amazing what they've done. But then we start talking about the future. So we've done the past, we've done the present, now we're going to get into the plans for Part 3. Now, straight off the bat, they promise that the world of Final Fantasy VII is going to be even bigger than it is now. They've done a lot of the groundwork that needed to be done in Remake and Rebirth, and they've got fans wondering what happens now and where the story goes from here. And they talk about the merging of nostalgia and new innovation again, so we can expect to see a lot more of the same, new scenes that we haven't seen before, coupled with old scenes with a new slant on them and a new perspective to them. I'm looking forward to it, and the team is apparently working to beat all of our expectations. And Hamaguchi, he says it a few times throughout this, but he's confident that Part 3 is going to become one of the most loved video games of all time, which is, it's a huge shout. It's a huge shout. But you've got to love the confidence. You really do. We talk a little bit about Sephiroth after that and changes as to how he's portrayed, because like in the past he was portrayed as kind of a Jaws type figure, whereas now that isn't going to work because everybody knows who Sephiroth is. So we get that, we've heard that before. We get some talk about the relationships in the party and how they enhance the combat and the narrative, and both of them talk about their favourite character interactions, and interestingly, Barrett is in both of them. So for Kitase, it's Barrett and Aerith, and for Hamaguchi, it's Barrett and Red 13. It's pretty interesting that Barrett gets himself in there for both of them. I mean, it's not surprising. Barrett is probably, outside of the main characters, the best character. Outside of Cloud, Sephiroth and Aerith, it is Barrett. Let's be completely honest. After this, though, they talk a little bit about combat and more of the mechanical stuff. And then we get on to talking about, like, big scenes for them, big moments for them in Rebirth. And for Kitase, he talks about the Barrett and Dyne scene, and talks about how he's now remade the scene how he saw it in his mind back in the 90s when they were making it the first time round. And for Hamaguchi, he talks about the flashback in the Shinra mansion, so where Sephiroth's read the book and Cloud interrupts him, and Sephiroth talks to us about Jenova and tells us the truth of his creation. And Hamaguchi talks about how more details could be added into these scenes now in order to convey what Sephiroth was going through, and just really drive it home and give us a lot more visual cues than we were able to have back in the OG. After this, we move on to the Q&A session, and there was a few interesting points that come up. One question talks about how difficult was it to integrate new characters into the remake project, and they go on to talk about Chadley and how they've integrated him. Originally, he was meant to just be a one-off character for one mission, something that Shinra had sent out to get a report, but then eventually he grew and grew and grew and ended up becoming this kind of guide character for the party, and kind of a resource that helps us out in different locations and points us in the direction of certain things and helps us out with materia. So they talk about how they kind of have these pretty simple ideas for characters, and then they just kind of flesh out and kind of grow and take on a life of their own, seemingly. They're asked about fan expectations when it comes to Part 3, and Hamaguchi says there are elements that have to be in there when developing the game. And he says that for the upcoming story section that we're getting to, so the first parts of Part 3, two of the big things that come to mind are the Highwind and snowboarding, and that they're going to be a big part of the experience for Part 3 and going forwards. He also talks about adding more mini-games to the world, as well as fleshing out and evolving games that already exist, like Queen's Blood. And a little bit later on, they talk a little bit more about Queen's Blood and how they're going to tweak it and maybe change it a little bit so it's not exactly the same as it is in Rebirth, so that there is then still that aspect of freshness and newness to it in Part 3. There's a question asking about catering to both sets of fans, be it the OG fans from back in the 90s or new fans that they're trying to attract into the franchise. And again, Kitase talks about mixing nostalgia with new in order to cater to both sets of fans. And they talk about how they want to stay as close as possible to the original story while adding in these new elements to add detail and expand the narrative further. But one thing that they keep saying is they want to stay as close as possible to the story, or the essence of the story. And it's that differentiation between the two. Are we going to stay true to the actual story, or are we going to stay true to the essence of the story? Because they could both mean different things, and both of those could wildly go in different directions. With staying true to the story, you know, doing what it says on the tin and staying true to the story, but staying true to the essence of the story, that could go in many different directions. So it's interesting that they keep kind of saying both. It's very interesting. And it's not just now, it's for years they've been doing this. And again, the example that they use is the ending of Rebirth having multiple different interpretations. So yeah, they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. We get a question about whether or not Tifa's going to be able to do the suplex limit break in Part 3. And we get a 50-50 on it, so they're not ruling it out completely. There is a possibility of suplex, so that's a good thing. We also, though, get confirmation that Vincent and Sid are going to be 100% controllable in Part 3, and that'll add a lot more synergy attacks, so maybe they'll be able to work out the suplex in a synergy attack. So they're obviously thinking about these things and looking into it. We also get the suggestion of a completely new system on top of synergy. We don't get any details about it, but there is the suggestion that there is another system that's going to be incorporated into the combat, and this makes sense. They were talking about how Queen's Blood's going to need aspects to be added to it in order to keep it feeling fresh. Same thing goes for the combat. In Remake, we didn't have synergies or any of that sort of thing, so they've been added in Rebirth to keep things feeling fresh, and the same will happen in Part 3. We'll get something new. We get a little bit of talk again about Sephiroth and his creation, about how it was a group project and they kind of did a third of it each, Nomura, Kitase and Najima. And he talks about how when they created Sephiroth, they wanted to add a bit of nuance to him as, you know, kind of like a different type of bad guy to what we'd previously seen. And that's kind of where the idea of him being a hero previously and someone that our protagonist will look up to kind of came into place, and a few other things. And then he also talks about how Sephiroth wants to fulfill his big destiny and his objective. And how he doesn't see himself as evil. It's almost as if he sees himself as above everybody else, with like a grander plan that those people won't really understand. He wants to create a better world under his control, seemingly. And that definitely feeds into what we see from Sephiroth, him wanting to return everything to the live stream and take control of that, and then obviously shape the world in his image, which is what he believes is his birthright to do. And it's going to be super interesting to see how that manifests itself in Part 3, because we've seen a lot of what Sephiroth's doing, and we can kind of guess what his endgame is, and it's probably going to be something adjacent to Advent Children Sephiroth's endgame, but we don't know. And from what they've done in the rest of the remake project, there's definitely going to be a new caveat added to Sephiroth, at least one. So we'll see how that pans out. We get a little bit of talk about the Highwind and how that's going to be integrated, and how they have to figure out how to make it traverse the world similarly to the OG, as well as adding things that you can do on the Highwind. And they both get very excited at this point, and Kitase jumps in and says that the plans for the Highwind are going to blow everyone away. And the suggestion is that there's something that we're going to be able to do on the Highwind that's very exciting. So, looking forwards to getting more information on that. And then finally they wrap up talking about the challenges of making the world of Rebirth, and making it feel how it does, and filling it up with interesting and fun activities. And not a lot of new stuff here, all very much stuff that we've already heard before. And that pretty much wraps it up. You get the usual closing statements, more guarantees that Part 3 is going to beat any expectations that any of us have got, which, again, the more I hear them say it, the more excited I get. Because Remake was a good game, Rebirth is a very good game. If they keep trending that way and Part 3 really is going to be as big a thing as they're suggesting it's going to be, maybe they're right. Maybe it is going to blow us all away and give us that Baldur's Gate 3 experience that a lot of us had last year, where gaming changed a little bit. Hopefully Remake Part 3 can do that, just like the OG did for me back in the 90s. The OG changed everything for me. And if Part 3 even comes close to the impact that Final Fantasy VII had on me, it's going to be big. It's going to be big. But yeah, that was pretty much everything that we got. The main thing to take away from it, I think, is they're going to continue with this angle of new and old, nostalgia but new perspectives on things, which is something that, you know, we're kind of all expecting anyway after the first two games. They're definitely going to continue in the same vein, but the suggestion is that the plans are going to be a lot grander going into Part 3, and that they really do want to absolutely smash it out of the park. And this kind of makes me think that this really is going to be the end of FF7 once Part 3 is done. And I'm kind of glad, but also sad, if that makes sense. It means that Remake Part 3 will hopefully give us a satisfying conclusion to the overarching Final Fantasy VII narrative. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if they did think of something new after Part 3 is finished. 10 years down the line, maybe they bring something else back. Who knows? Other things to take away from this: the Highwind, like Highwind hype, minigames are coming back as well with a vengeance. Not really much said about the story. Very much all the things that we've already kind of seen and heard about the story, about how it's kind of giving us new perspectives on these events and kind of changing them a little bit just to create that bit of doubt in our minds. So no juicy information there, but over the next 2 or 3 years, as we get closer and closer and closer to the release, we will get that juicy information, I guarantee it. All in all though, it was an interesting presentation. Like I say, few cool little bits. Let me know what you're most interested in. I'm going to guess a lot of people are very interested in Vincent and Cid gameplay. I'm very interested in Vincent and Cid gameplay. Vincent, I think, will probably function pretty simple for the most part, very similar to Barrett. The difficulty with Vincent's going to be incorporating the Galian Beast form or any of his other Chaos forms. Cid probably ends up functioning very much like Sonon, but with some differences, because Sonon uses a staff, whereas Cid uses the old spear and is very much the Dragoon. So it's going to be fun to get to see some Dragoon gameplay in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Yeah, this has done enough to kind of push the excitement up another level, kind of let us know where they're at as far as the project goes, and yeah, good times ahead. But that's going to be the end of this one, so leave your thoughts in the comments below, let me know what you're thinking. I don't think this is viewable anywhere online anymore. If it is, I will leave a link in the description below so that you can find it. But yeah, as far as I can tell, it's not available online anymore, so yeah, that sucks. But let me know what you're thinking in the comments below, like the video, subscribe for future content, but more importantly than all of that, have a great day.